I'm Tyler Schlumbo, and I'm the co-vice president of Phi Sigma Tau. So as part of Phi Sigma Tau's spring program on language and meaning in the liberal arts, which is generally sponsored by the SGA, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. William Desmond. Professor Desmond, a native of Ireland, is professor of philosophy at Leuven University in Belgium and also at Villanova University. The work of Professor Desmond addresses questions in metaphysics, ethics, aesthetics, philosophy of religion, and political theory. He is the author of over 20 books and countless scholarly articles. He has agreed to take questions after his talk, so if we can just wait till then, we can ask questions then. So, Dr. Desmond.
Thank you very much for introducing me. I guess you can ask questions now if you want to, if you're so impatient and your spirit of inquiry is so alive in Virginia that you want to know now. I also want to thank Professor Anne Wiles for the invitation. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here and talk to you. So I'm talking tonight about Irish thought and literature, and I am a native Irish person, but I've lived in America for long periods of time, so I'm a naturalized American citizen, so I'm a creature of multiple identities, and that's in some ways part of the theme that I think is very relevant to the condition of what it means to be Irish. I wrote a little book a few years ago, called Being Between, Conditions of Irish Thought. And I talk about this condition of being between in a broad sense, but also look at a number of significant thinkers and some literary figures in Irish history in which different variations on this being between are manifested. So what I will do tonight is I'll say a little bit about this being between at the start, in an autobiographical sense and perhaps also in a more philosophical sense. And then I'll just take a few examples. There are many individuals I could look at in more detail, but I thought I'd look at, again, time permitting, a thinker called John Toland, not well known but interesting. Another philosopher, George Berkeley, well known within the tradition of philosophy. And then I thought I'd finish talking about Jonathan Swift, a writer in literature, again, very well known, famous for Gulliver's Travels. But even though he's not a philosopher in the technical, professional sense, there are very significant philosophical dimensions to some of the things that he does. So, first of all, this notion of being between. I mentioned that I'm native-born Irish, but I came here to America in the early 70s. I did my PhD at Penn State. And now again, this might just seem like an accident of my personal history, but at that particular time, one of the things I noticed is that Ireland constituted a kind of world unto itself, and coming to America, America constituted a world unto itself. And there was a certain sense in which neither was reducible to the other. So you had two worlds, and there was an irreducible difference between them. So how to think of that space between worlds that couldn't be reduced to some simple underlying unity? I'd been studying a philosopher, and have continued to study a philosopher called Hegel, a German philosopher, one of the great figures of the history of philosophy. And in his way of thinking, differences are always a prelude to some more encompassing unity. So if you had two different worlds or two different concepts, if you stick with it, eventually a larger unity will come to enfold the differences. So my own experience at that particular time, this is again speaking more personally, existentially, is that there didn't seem to be any larger whole within which these two worlds could be included as simply parts of the larger whole. So I began to reflect on the notion of the between. Now, when I talk about the between, people immediately ask me, between what and what? And then I said, no, it's the between, whatever that is. Now, I've written many books trying to explain what that is. But one of the origins for this notion of the between comes from Plato. Again, some of you philosophy students have read Plato, but in his book, his dialogue called the Symposium, he talks about eros as a metaxou. Again, some of you are Greek scholars, so the word metaxou simply means between. And in Plato, the metaxou is, eros as a metaxou is between the mortals and the divinities. So it's the middle space between the human and the more than human. But the interesting thing about Plato is that the between can never be reduced to some simple unity. The difference always remains. So what I've been trying to do for the last decades really is to develop what I call a metaxological philosophy. Again, that sounds like a very ugly word. I admit that the first time you hear it. But I've been using it for a long time now, so it's a little bit like Gollum in, you know, The Lord of the Rings. It's my precious. I have a certain tender feeling for the particular word metaxou, but a logos of the metaxou, giving an account or rational articulation of what it means to be between. So what I've tried to do also in relation to Irish thinkers and some of the literary figures also is to see if this notion of the metaxou, this notion of the between, is applicable to make sense of some of their distinguishing characteristics. Okay, that's the first point. I'll come back to that and just give an indication with the individuals that I've mentioned. The second point is this: if you know anything about Irish history, you'll know that it's a quite broken history. It's full of ruptures, and the major rupture in modernity has really been from the beginning of the 17th century right into the 20th century, where Ireland was the first colony, in fact, and the efforts to colonise Ireland from England date back centuries before then. But at the beginning of the 17th century, in a certain sense, it was more successful. So at that time too, you had a native tradition in which Gaelic, Irish, was the language of the natives. And after that, you have this tension between two worlds again. The Gaelic world, Irish-speaking, and also in this instance bound up with the Reformation, the religious divisions of the continent in terms of Protestants and Catholics also formed a particular variation in Irish history. So one of the themes within modern Irish history is the question of language. You could ask yourself the question: if you can't word your world in your own language, do you really inhabit your own world? And particularly in the 19th century, the Irish lost their own language due to many factors, but the famine was, again, a major factor. Irish people coming from mostly peasant background came to America because there was no economic future for them in Ireland, and of course Irish was an impediment to economic advancement. So if you lose a language and you take up a new language, in some ways you can be a creature of two languages, two different ways of wording the world, so to say. And I think that that's, again, part of something has entered into the Irish consciousness in relation to different layers. An example here, James Joyce. You've heard of James Joyce. Joyce has a nice phrase where he is asked what he is trying to do, and his answer is the following. He uses this phrase: he's trying to think two thinks at a time. Two thinks at a time. So in other words, not just one thought and another thought and another thought, but to think a thought that would have, again, multiplicity, so to say, built into it. And again, this is a theme very relevant to the nature of poetry, for instance. If you're an aficionado of poetry, it's not univocal in the sense of just simply having one meaning. It's layered, it's plurivocal, it's multivocal. So again, just to make this last point about, say, parts of the Irish tradition, if you are a subject people, but you have a reality of your own, you may talk to your masters in one way, but the meaning of your words might look quite differently to those in the subjected community. You may learn to speak in a variety of different levels, and some of it may be only intelligible to some people. It appears to say one thing, and sometimes it appears, the appearance hides the fact that it says perhaps even the opposite of what it appears to say. So I talk about that, and it's again very important in my work, in terms of equivocity, the equivocal, to speak equivocally. When someone equivocates, they say one thing, but in fact they may mean more than one thing by that. Someone says yes, and they really mean no. Someone says no, and they really mean yes. Someone says no, and they might mean maybe. So this notion of equivocation, I think, is very related, deeply embedded in what it means to be a human being. Again, just two examples. One of, say, erotic relations. If erotic relations were just univocal, yes would mean yes, and no would mean no. But if somebody says yes differently, or says no, let's say somebody says no differently, you could say to your beloved, darling, are you free tonight? And she might say, no. Or she might say, no. Now, the same word is used, but the no that is soft might have within it a kind of possibility of maybe. Or again, take the example of humor. Can you have humor if there isn't ambiguity? Now again, this is one of the reasons why later when I come to Jonathan Swift, I'll talk about comedy, the sense for the comic. If everything is just simply logically univocal, in a certain sense there are no jokes. It's when you have this multi-layered way of speaking where something can mean the opposite of what it appears to mean, that the possibility of irony, for instance, emerges very, very clearly. Okay, now, is there such a thing as the Irish mind? This has been something that Irish people have asked about themselves, and some scholars have asked about it also. There was a book published maybe 25 years ago called The Irish Mind, and the editor was a person who is very eminent in his own right, Richard Carney, who's also an Irish thinker and writer. But he was immediately attacked by many people because they felt that if there is such a thing as the Irish mind, it so to say essentializes what it means to be Irish. To be Irish is to have one univocal essence. And if you have a country where people look back to different traditions, a Catholic nationalist looking back to one set of loyalties, Protestant unionists looking to a different set of loyalties, you seem to be excluding one. It's a kind of an either-or. Now, I want to say this, that if you look at the history of philosophy, there are certain nations, actually, there are peoples that seem to have a clear identity as thinkers. We talk about the Greeks, for instance, in philosophy. We talk about the Germans in philosophy. We talk about an Anglo-Saxon tradition, indeed now an Anglo-American tradition. Is there anything like an Irish tradition in thought? What I try to do is to say that there's not just one essence to being Irish, but there's a constellation of possibilities, and some of them are overlapping. So once again, there isn't one univocal essence which you could just write out and everyone fits into it, but rather you have a range of possibilities. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't overlap. And this notion of being between, as I explained it just a little bit earlier, I think that allows you a kind of supple interplay between sameness and otherness, between identity and difference. So I thought I'd look at, as I said earlier, three thinkers, and I'll read just a few pages in relation to each of them. So the first person I want to talk about is a guy called John Toland. And John Toland is, again, not well known as one of the major thinkers in the history of philosophy, but he's sort of in the second leagues. But he was very influential at the beginnings of modernity. We're talking about now the end of the 17th century, that rupture that I mentioned at the beginning, where you had two different traditions, two communities taking place, taking shape in Irish history. Some of you have heard of pantheism. Who's heard of pantheism? Do you know what pantheism is? The few people know it. Pantheism is the view that the whole is divine. Theism is the view that the world is not divine, but there is a divinity beyond the world. There are a whole host of theological possibilities in looking at the world. But Toland invented this word pantheism, and is known for this. But his dates are 1670 to 1722. So again, we're talking about the beginnings of modernity. But he wrote this book called Christianity Not Mysterious, the subtitle of which is the following: a treatise showing that there is nothing in the gospel contrary to reason nor above it, and that no Christian doctrine can properly be called a mystery. So Christianity Not Mysterious. Now this is the beginnings of modernity, where the tension between religion and philosophy, or religion and reason, tends to get more accentuated. And the notion of Christianity throughout its history, of course, is a belief in a transcendent mystery of the divine, indeed the mystery of the incarnation, the mystery of the Trinity. So here at the beginnings of modernity, you have a thinker who wants to claim that there is nothing mysterious about Christianity. And you might think that this would be something acceptable to the Christians. But the interesting thing is, no sooner had he published the book, but the authorities condemned it. And he went back to Dublin expecting to be feted as a celebrity author, but the authorities wanted to put him in jail. He managed, fortunately, to escape the authorities. So in lieu of putting him on trial, they put the book on trial. In those earlier days, people were much more passionate about things like this. So what they did actually is they found the book guilty, they hung it, and they burnt it afterwards. So you should ask your professors if they've ever written a book that has deserved such a passionate response from those who disagree with it. And I have a feeling that you won't have many professors who've been treated with such great tender hatred. So again, he's a pantheist, so he sees himself as a creature of the universe. He says, again, I just quote him, he says, "I'm a child of the all. The sun is my father, the earth my mother, the world's my country, and all men are my relations." This is a kind of a cosmopolitanism that you'll find today, for instance, in its own different forms. But come back to this doubleness that I was talking about. And so he was born a Catholic in an Irish-speaking part of Donegal, which is right up there in the northwest, the Inishowen Peninsula. He was christened, it seemed, in the Irish language. He knew the Irish language. And his Irish name was Sean Owen I Hualan, which he then later changed into Latin as Janus Junius Toland. Janus, January, two-faced, looking back and looking forward. This sense of doubleness. But his story, again, just to help you put a face on him, he was born a Catholic. He was seen by a Protestant pastor as someone with talent. He was educated by the Protestants. He became a Protestant, but when he became a Protestant, he then moved from the established church to what were known as the dissenters. He became a Presbyterian. Okay, so again, some of you may know something about the history of Christianity, but in Ireland, certainly, you had Catholics who were Irish speakers. You had the Anglican establishment, the Church of England, in Ireland, and that was the established church. But you had Protestants who dissented from the Anglican establishment. A large number of them actually came to America at the founding, and perhaps America would not be Protestant in the way that it was if these dissenters had not come here in opposition to the established Church of England. So the question was this. This guy, John Toland, he looked very ambiguous because he came from a Catholic background. He moves through a variety of Protestantism. He writes a book that seems to deny that there's anything esoteric about Christianity. It's a book written which seems to indicate that Christianity doesn't need an established clergy, because if there's nothing mysterious about it, you can just read the gospel and you have a direct access to the divine. So that looks like a religious doctrine, but it, in its own way, has political implications. Because if the established church has no right to claim through its clergy a special relation to the divine, then it loses its privileges. Okay? Again, this may seem like a mere intellectual possibility to you, but in those days, if you were not a member of the Church of Ireland, you still had to pay a tithe to, if you were a Catholic, you had to pay a tithe to the established church. If you were a dissenting Protestant, you also had to pay a tithe. So you had to support a particular version of Christianity even though you didn't commit yourself to it. So if Christianity is not mysterious, there's a secret potential for a kind of democratizing of religious access to the truth. But that implies then that the hierarchical relations between the Church of England and the other forms of Christianity at that particular time, it loses its justification. So this is again one of the reasons why the book was burnt. Its theology is not necessarily orthodox, but in fact it was as much seen as a political attack on the established order as a theological doctrine. So what looks like a simple thing on the surface, in fact, is layered in manners that are not always so univocal, not always so easy to read. This guy told him again. I just to say a few more words on him. His enemies thought actually he was either a Jesuit or the son of a Jesuit. Now again, I don't know if you know, the tradition of the Jesuits has often been associated with equivocation. If you know Hamlet's Macbeth, you know Hamlet's Macbeth. There's the scene where the porter goes to the gate just after Macbeth has killed Duncan, but there's a kind of a drunken sermon by this porter on equivocation, where you say yes and you mean no. You can swear on both sides of the question. But the Jesuits are invoked again and again as equivocators, because they present themselves as one thing supposedly, and their reality is the opposite. But this guy, who was a Protestant, was accused of being a Jesuit precisely because the feeling was that he presented one face, but the secret face was really the face of popery, as it was called then. Okay, we're in the south here, so we're in more kind of Protestant, I'm in a more Protestant area than other parts of the States. But this is the interesting thing. Suppose, in fact, you were a secret agent for another power. This is part of this double condition of being between. And I'll give you an example that I've heard in Leuven, actually. There was a story told about a person who was trained by the Jesuits. And while he was trained by the Jesuits, he lost his faith. So he left the Jesuits. But then he became a raging atheist, attacking the church, left, right, and centre. But he was attacking the church in such stupid arguments that even the atheists were ashamed of him. Now, this is a story, I know the particular person, and so a person who's an atheist giving arguments about atheism that are so stupid that even the atheists wished he'd shut up. So the question was really whether he was a double agent of the Jesuits, that the Jesuits had trained an agent to go out as an atheist and give such stupid arguments that, in fact, arguments for belief in God looked even better. Just think about it this way: if you're a spy in an enemy country, you don't go around with a banner saying, "I am a spy." You know, if you're a German in England during the war, you don't go around, you know, say, giving the Hitler salute. You act most like an insider, though in fact you're an outsider. The best kind of spy is the person who presents themselves, again, as most intimate, such that you can't tell the difference between an insider and an outsider. I'll give you another example, which is, I'll just briefly mention it. Edmund Burke is another Irish thinker. He spent most of his life in England, but he was always accused of being a Jesuit. His mother was Catholic. His father became a lawyer. By some people believe you had to convert to Protestantism to function as a lawyer. But when he went to England, his political enemies always accused him of being a Jesuit, namely someone who was a complete insider in one sense, but in fact, being an insider, his real loyalties lay elsewhere. So again, this is a very complicated condition. It's not a simple, univocal condition where you have one set of loyalties. Your loyalties may be expressed in such a manner that what looks like loyalty to one side may in fact be secretly loyalty to the other side. So it creates a situation in mind and in language which particularly feeds the imagination. And this is perhaps one of the reasons some people feel that in modernity, some of the great literary writers, some of the great imaginative writers have this feel for this complex richness of language that is almost inexhaustible. You can't reduce it just simply to one interpretation. Okay, this guy Toland was what later became known as a free thinker. Free thinking is, again, an attitude that we've become much more familiar with now, but basically, in relation to religious matters, very, very critical, and believing that by reason alone you could make a discriminate judgment. You didn't have to rely upon the established churches. But the second person I'd just like to look at is George Berkeley, and he seems to be exactly the opposite. Now again, some of you are philosophy students and you've heard of Berkeley. He was an Anglican priest. He was a bishop, in fact. But he was born in Ireland also, and I have a particular interest in him because he ended up in that part of Cork from which I myself come. He ended up as a bishop in Cloyne. That's a particular area in East Cork. But he's the person who is named after Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. He came to America at a particular point trying to set up a school in Rhode Island. He wanted to set up a whole school there, not only for the European pilgrims, but also for the native Indians. He had this idealistic, utopian view that the American Indians could be educated to the civilizational level of European Protestants. But he's famous, he's said to be an idealist. Again, some of you know this. He's famous for the claim that to be is to perceive or to be perceived. So existence is correlated with perception. And a view like that seems to reduce the object in its otherness to my mind. And he was famously, supposedly refuted by Dr. Johnston. Now again, some of you know the story, some of you don't. But the story states that Dr. Johnston, again a famous figure in English letters, he kicks a stone, kicks the stone and he says, "Thus I refute Berkeley." So what Johnston stands for is sound common sense. The world is there in all its solidity. Whereas someone like Berkeley is an idealist who dissolves the world into our minds, into our subjectivity. Now again, you can see the point. How could the world be correlated simply to my mind? But he does make arguments that if there isn't a mind to perceive what is there, we can't actually intelligibly say what is there. Every statement about what is there presupposes someone in relation to it. How else would we know that there was something there if there was not some perceiver or some knower relating to the object there. In any case, Berkeley was often mocked as crazy, that this was the craziness of an idealistic philosophy that couldn't do justice to everyday experience. The interesting thing is that Berkeley himself felt that he was more true to everyday experience than what he saw as the emergent sciences. And he actually offers quite, impressive arguments. You have to take these arguments into account. He has a theory of vision that has proved to be quite influential right into the 20th century. But the question is this: if the world is relative to the mind, the question is, what mind is it relative to? And as Berkeley develops his theory, in fact, it's not simply my mind. In the end, it's the mind of God. So everything that is correlated with mind, but it's not the finite mind of you or I, it's the infinite mind. So again, is it an Irish characteristic? But it's a rejection of materialism, to be sure. Berkeley thought that in modernity, matter was being presented as a rival god to the traditional god of monotheism. So he wanted to, as it were, deconstruct the concept of matter itself. Now again, you might say that this is again the 17th century, beginning of the 18th century. Many of the same arguments many of the same claims are made in our own time by some of the most eminent scientists at the moment. If you move among scientists and a very large majority of intellectuals, what obtains there is what I would call a default atheism. Atheism is often the default position of many intellectuals today, and a kind of physicalism or reductionism, which thinks that everything can be explained in purely materialistic terms alone. Default atheism is, what a default position is, what you fall back on if the system is subject to pressure. There's a default position that somehow keeps the system in at least a continuing equilibrium. There was a time in European history where theism, belief, was the default position. But you could make the claim, I would make the claim that, again, for many intellectuals, atheism has become the default position rather than theism. And it would be an interesting question to pursue the justification for one default position as opposed to the other default position. In any case, Berkeley is a default theist, not a default atheist. And his arguments, while looking crazy from the standpoint of common sense, are aimed at the belief that the abstractions of science create, in fact, a set of abstractions that don't dovetail with our ordinary experience of the world. So it's a very paradoxical situation, again, that what looks like a deconstruction of common sense claims, in fact, to be true to common sense more so than the scientific or scientistic theories and productions that were very much coming on the scene at the beginnings of modernity with the development of modern science and technology and so on. Just this point here. The solidity of the world, okay? We think the world is solid. Berkeley developed a view, actually, that the things of the world that we perceived could be rendered in terms of an understanding of signs, or perceptions or signs. So again, it's not explored as deeply as I think it could be or should be, but everything that we perceive, he eventually began to think was the sign language of God. So it's an interesting thought that instead of just solid things, the world is in fact a set of communications. It's a kind of desolidification of the world, almost liquefaction of the world, making it more liquid, making it more porous to something beyond itself. Again, if you know something about the Irish sense of the sacred, at least as it's sometimes expressed by their poets, there is this sense in Ireland that there has been, at least in the past, we've become highly secularized in recent decades, that this world and the other world are really side by side and barely separated by a very porous threshold, and that in certain circumstances you might easily find yourself on the opposite side, so as that the other side and this side are in sometimes very ambiguous communications with each other. An illustration, you know the festival of Halloween. Halloween is originally a Celtic festival, but Halloween falls at a certain time in the astrological circle where this world and the other world are most porous to each other. That's why when you go out and see Dracula walking the streets, or whoever, what monster, I remember when the first time I came to America, going out on Halloween and seeing these monsters walking around, and I was actually frightened, because the monsters in Ireland weren't so well dressed in costumes. Now that's a long time ago. I've become less of a child since then. But this porousness between, we've forgotten really the feeling of earlier peoples, which was a cosmic feeling that the world itself was not a set of clear and distinct facts. It's not univocal, it's equivocal, ambiguous through and through. And this threshold between what we call this world and the other world is far less fixed and solid than our everyday convictions seem to dictate. If you do go to Ireland, I would say pay attention to the two areas of twilight and dawn. I talk in this little book actually about an experience of running a race. I used to be a road racer in my younger days, but I ran a race just in the place where Berkeley ended up, Cloyne, East Cork. Race starting about 8 o'clock, twilight coming on, running in all these back country roads, and you got this feeling really that there was this porosity between where we were here and something much more mysterious in the trees, in the clouds. And again, this is a seedbed really for a certain poetic orientation towards the world, which is in its own way in tension with the more scientific and objectivizing orientation that has become so much part of our lives these days. So you can see Berkeley, even though again he's a strange philosopher, as trying to see that the world is saturated with these signs that for the most part we can't read at all. Just one last citation there. You've heard of William Butler Yeats, the great Irish poet, but he says in a particular place that Locke and Newton, again Newton taken as the great scientist in modernity, he said Locke and Newton gave us excrement and Berkeley restored the world. Now you know what excrement is, and it seems like a crazy thing to say that Locke and Newton, the great scientific enlighteners of modernity, gave us excrement. Well, what Yeats was getting at there was that if the world is simply as the scientific picture presents itself to us, we can't live in that world as human beings. We make more and more scientific sense of things, but our lives in the process become more and more senseless. The more light we seem to throw on things, the more dark our place in the cosmos becomes. But he saw Berkeley as restoring the world. And you could ask yourself the question, what does it mean to restore the world? Could you lose the world? We're in the world all the time, but how could you lose the world and need it to be restored? Part of Yeats's vocation as a poet, I think, was to speak in such a way that this richer sense of the world was restored in some measure. Okay. A last figure that I want to talk about is Jonathan Swift. And again, I'm sort of seem to be staying in the 17th century, 18th century, but you all know Jonathan Swift, the Gulliver's Travels. In my youth, Disney made a version of Gulliver's Travels. You can see it on YouTube now. and it's complete kitsch. It's complete schlock. Gulliver's Travels is one of the works of genius in Western history. Swift was a person who was subject to fits of disgust against the human race. He had a very bleak and dark vision of the human race, but he had a sense of humor and genius with language, which was really world class. We're familiar with the voyage to Lilliput, where he's big and the Lilliputians are small. We're familiar with the Brobdingnagians, where he's small and they're big. And just think about this as the reversal of scale, how the world looks different to us. If we're big and everything else is small, the world alters in its configuration. Or vice versa, if we're small and everything else is big. So this kind of relativity between us and what is other to us is a form of this metaxou, understood here actually in a very comic sense. So this is what I want to just, in my third little episode today, talk about the comic dimensions of this. Because again, if you know something about Irish culture, I think this feeling for the absurdity and the comic is quite notable. Again, it's not to be human is to actually have a feel for the absurd and the comic, but it gets differently refracted in different cultures. In the book Gulliver's Travels, there are two other books. One is to a place called The Voyage to Legado, and that's a fascinating. If you ever want to study a comic deconstruction of modern science, you'll find it there, because he goes to this particular island, and there's a place there which is a parody of the Royal Society for the Sciences in London, where all the scientists are doing projects. And I'll just give you a number of the projects here. For instance, he witnessed scientists trying to extract sunbeams out of cucumbers to be put in vials, hermetically sealed, and let out to warm the air in raw, inclement summers. There are scientists who are trying to reduce human excrement to its original food. It would solve the problem of food in the world if that could be done. There are architects trying to build houses beginning from the roof and working downwards. There are improvements in agriculture, ploughing the ground with hogs to save the charges for ploughs, cattle and labour. So there are all these improving projects claiming to have a scientific warrant, but when you begin to look at them, they have an absurdity about them, at least. So I'll just read. I'll read. I haven't read anything yet, so there actually are words on my. I mean, if I had blank pages, but who knows? There might be my tax returns. But he has one image on this. There's a flying island. Okay, and again, just think about it in relation to drones. Imagine if you had huge drones, so this imagination of the flying island. So we're elevated above the earth only to be brought back down with salutary laughter, saving laughter. Instead of being between earth and heaven with our feet on the ground, we think we are the natives of a flying mathematical island above the earth and no longer in the between below. Because we can be above, but how we are above is all important. So there is a theory that this flying island is supposed to be England, in fact. That England hovers over Ireland, and at various times it kind of comes down and puts pressure on the native people in Ireland. There was one episode where the island hovers over a town, and it's putting pressure on those on the ground. And all the natives on the ground, they get their pots and pans, and they gather them together. It interferes with the magnet. This is controlled by magnets. So the island, the mathematical island, is in danger of crashing onto the ground, and they quickly try to fly away. So it's a metaphor really for a kind of hovering will to power. And again, it seems to me that this is a hugely modern question. that as we become more powerful through the technologies that come out of our new sciences, we have more control of things, but the control itself is not necessarily informed by a kind of wise humanness. And I think that that's a thing that, to a degree, drove Jonathan Swift almost mad. He has a picture there of thinkers on this island, and they have all these Pythagorean symbols on their coats, and apparently one eye goes up to the meridian and one eye goes down to the horizontal, so they're kind of cross-eyed almost. They are lost in thought, and again you can apply this to your professors if you desire to do so, but they're accompanied by servants who carry what are called flappers. These servants are flappers. They have this bladder, which is an inflated pig bladder, and when a professor wants to talk to another professor, the servant flaps him on the mouth to remind him, to bring him out of the abstract thought, or if he's supposed to listen, he gets flapped on the ears. So the conversation proceeds only with the help of these flappers. But the interesting thing is, and again I'll just read it, Swift was acutely aware of the place of the body in comedy, and he points out that the neglected wives of the Laputan thinkers are always running away from the floating mathematical island, returning to the earth and having love affairs with servants, committing adultery even before the disengaged eyes of their cogitating husbands. Comedy, it seems, honors the god Comus, the god of fertility. Some of you won't remember this a bit before your time, but Monty Python had a tape. This is, I think, The Meaning of Life, and there were certain sketches that didn't get into the movie. But there's one sketch where a professor of logic comes home in the evening and he finds that his dinner isn't ready. And his wife tells him that she's been having an affair with the milkman. And the professor doesn't pay any attention to the fact that she's having an affair with the milkman. He says something, this is John Cleese, I think, speaking. He says, there is no logically necessitated connection between screwing the milkman in the morning and having my dinner ready for me when I come home from the office. It's impeccable logic, it's correct. There is no logically validated connection between her adultery and having the dinner ready. But of course, you wouldn't blame his wife if you had a professor like that for finding some consolation with the milkman. Now, if you like, in question time, some of the major writers of the 20th century are highly comic. James Joyce. James Joyce is often treated like some kind of divine creature now by the kind of very devout scholars, but his work is comic work. It's laughter. Similarly, Beckett. Beckett is sometimes celebrated as the great prophet of modern nihilism. But if it's nihilism, it's a kind of nihilism that sees the absurdity in the human condition, but tries in the absurdity to continue, not just simply to fail. I just mentioned this last thing in one of the projects on the Flying Island in Swift, and I'll end with that. He has a wonderful satire for a project to abolish words. Now again, it's deeply philosophical because the theory is this. What are words? Words are representations of things. So why not just get rid of the representations and just have the things? This was a debate actually in analytic philosophy in the 20th century. What do words represent things? So if they represent things, why do we need the words? Why don't we just have the things? Why don't we abolish the words? Now again, if you know Beckett, he's in the business of trying to abolish words because he wants to retract into a kind of silence. This is the way Swift. Why not shorten discourse by cutting polysyllables into one and leaving out verbs and participles? So in other words, getting rid of language. better. Why not get rid of the words altogether and just communicate with things? Among other things, and this is the justification for this, it would save our lungs from corrosion. We wouldn't have to be talking. Hence, speaking words that would no longer shorten our lives. He gives us a picture of people who, if they were to converse, and this is again they must carry around a bundle of things on their backs. So you see these students these days, and myself too, with my backpack. I have my things in the backpack. So when I meet a fellow professor, we don't talk. I take my things out of the backpack and I have a conversation by showing the things. So whatever I have it. So this is it, you know. One meets others, a conversation ensues in which one person shows the other the things, and reciprocally the other shows their things, wordlessly. And then the great advantage would seem to be a universal language. This is basically what Swift said. Since things are generally of the same kind throughout the civilized nations. But then the narrator goes on to say, the women, once again, spoil it all, as do the ordinary people. Because the women and the ordinary people insist on talking in the old ways that their fathers and forefathers used to do. And again, the commentator said, so they prove themselves irreconcilable enemies of science. Now, this is all done in a deadpan tone. It's a satire against the abstractions of reason and the sometimes crazy projects that are thought up to improve life, but in fact in improving life they make it a much more difficult thing for people. So maybe this is a good place to end with the rebellion of the women and the ordinary people. Their desire to continue to speak, to word the between is a prompt for me now to end and to return to silence. So, thank you. Please.
Thank you for your talk. It was wonderful. I wanted to ask you a question about Marx. And about Marx.
Marx?
But actually, I wanted to make a point.
Karl Marx.
Well, yeah, and also the Marx brothers.
Marx
I also thought of it in terms of the last point that you made about Swift, and it made me think of, you know, why not abolish language? Why not just speak in terms of things? And it makes me think of Harpo in Marx Brothers, right? And that's always the comedic aspect, is he plays on the equivocity of these things themselves, right?
Yeah.
So that's just a sort of side point, but that's an interesting comment.
Of course, Harpo is surrounded by words, so his silence is always within the context of word leaps. So it's an interesting question whether we can ever step outside the space of words. I mentioned Beckett there. Beckett, in his later writings, is going more and more silent. He seems to be, as it were, trying to back out of words. But of course, he has to use words to back out of the words. So the kind of interplay between silence and the word is really what's at stake in the incongruity that sometimes gives rise to absurd situations.
Yeah. And even the things themselves he's showing are illicitness in some way, because oftentimes it's playing on the literal meaning and the meaning in the context. So the thing itself is never just a thing; it's always, in a certain sense, a word.
Right. I mean, the people who went around with things, in Swift's satire, he points out, and this is perhaps related to the other Marx, that those who are richer have servants who carry the things for them. So you have the relation between the master and the servant still in the social context. So instead of the master having to carry his bag of things, his servant will carry the things. And I guess, like a caddy on the golf course, I want that, you kind of show it, and so on. You know? So there's a whole critique of social structure there also, in fact.
Okay, and then the other point I just wanted to get to is you're sort of telling the story about the, history of modernity in a lot of ways, and this kind of disenchantment of nature.
Yeah.
But I think this is an interesting point in that, idealism comes in as a kind of reaction to this and you attempt to re-enchant nature in some way, or to reinvest this sort of symbolic in nature. And then I thought, Marx is an interesting sort of counterpoint to this narrative, because you could say one of the things that he's doing in, say, Capital is showing that, that what is being described as a kind of materialism is actually already deeply invested with some kind of, let's say, symbolic form, and this comes down to the basic analysis, I would say, of the commodity as what he calls a sensuous, supersensuous form. And so this points to, in a way, the kind of complexity of that materialism, of that tradition of capitalist progression.
I mean, the mention of, say, German idealism, and pantheism, I mentioned pantheism early on with Toland, and the whole way romantic culture was very influenced by Spinoza as the god for drunken man, the god of intoxicated man. Nature now seen as having this immanent divinity rather than something. But I think in the case of Marx, I've been a student of Hegel all my life. Even though Marx sees the fetishization of the commodity, it takes on a quasi-religious character and like a spook that has a life of its own. His way of thinking about nature, in my view, there's a real tension between nature understood as having a right to be for itself alone, and nature as a resource for human productivity. And it's the second side, that it's only for productive use, that feeds into perhaps the dominant strain in modernity. So there's a whole issue to be pursued there further, but I think the history of communism, certainly behind the Iron Curtain, was that nature was treated with tremendous disrespect, in the belief that the human being was the industrial agent of history per se. A guy like Berkeley would be very much against that. Even though, in fact, Berkeley had a great reputation for being a good person, in fact. Ireland was riven between the ascendancy, as it was called, literally the ascendancy, and then the peasants were often living in tremendous destitution. And as the Bishop of Cloyne, his reputation as a good person persists even to this day. At least I've been down there and I sometimes talk to people, but it's a different orientation to nature than just seeing nature as a set of resources that we have to work up into either commodities or exploit in one way. And that issue is the whole issue of the environment, looking at the earth differently, which is absolutely a live issue in our own time. And I would say, presenting Berkeley the way I was doing, I was trying to also, the strangeness of nature when we actually confront it in its otherness, and not just merely a means to an end to our own expanded will to power. I think that's not only deeply contemporary now, but is a huge issue for the future. Thank you. Please.
How do you feel that the metaxological Irish identity has changed in the late 20th century under the Troubles, and now continuing under the Good Friday Agreement?
Well, there are two questions there, I think. What I think now is that sense of difference, I mentioned that sense of difference at the start where the two worlds couldn't be reduced to one. I think that difference has been weakened, made much more feeble. And it's basically, I think, due to the sort of globalization of a particular form of capitalism. If you go to airports all over the world, you could be anywhere. And there are, and the tremendous developments in media and cybernetics and so on have produced a strange proliferation of differences, but at another level, a strange homogeneity. So Ireland has itself come into global capitalism in a way that, to a degree, has weakened its more singular characteristics. Some people are very happy with that. They would hate even me to say something like this because they see it as the only way to have a prosperous modern economy. But something is certainly lost in the process. And I think that's a question for all of us in the global economy, really. Are we just homogeneously substitutable for each other? I mean, we have the language of difference. Be yourself. Be all you can be in the army. Be original. And we all turn out to be the same. So there's a strange inversion of difference into sameness. The Northern Ireland situation is, again, I'll only just say this. At the moment, it's particularly very fraught. With the Brexit in England, the whole set of relations between the different countries, Scotland, Wales, England, Northern Ireland, the Irish Republic, there's a kind of a dangerous instability. And you see, after the agreement, the Good Friday Agreement, there was effectively no border between North and South. People could move up, and there were no presences of British soldiers on the border. There were no customs. It was an open border, such that there was no border. And economic activity between North and South thrived tremendously. So even those in Northern Ireland that didn't want anything to do with the South have seen actually the benefits of open communication North and South. But what's happening now is that the South of Ireland remains in the European Union. The North of Ireland is being taken out of it. So, and one of the reasons why the Brits wanted to leave Europe is emigration. They wanted hard borders. And if they introduce a hard border in Northern Ireland, all these traditional animosities could very easily flare up again. There's a lot of talk in Europe and in London and in Dublin about trying to keep the border as porous as possible. But will it be possible? Because if you can get into Ireland, then you can get into Northern Ireland, then you can get into Great Britain, across. So again, you might find it interesting. There is more talk about a united Ireland now than ever before in the last 30 or 40 years. There's an Irish newspaper called the Irish Times that traditionally, I would say, was very unionist. This is back earlier. Irish unity was a no-go area. But now you have advanced journalists raising the question, well, perhaps something like this has to be rethought, and maybe a more confederalist Ireland, who knows? So things are up for grabs on that particular score. Please.
So when you mention like the thin veil between the two worlds,
yeah,
I always think of like, the apparitions, right? Of like, the Virgin Mary, in a ditch, in like the likes of Knock and the moving statue in Ballinasmittle.
Ballinasmittle,
right?
Yeah.
And so like, also as a person who's moved to this part of the world, I'm always wondering, why are there not these sites in like these Irish enclaves in say South Philly, right? A part of the world that you're from.
Yeah.
And are we somehow kind of positing that like this thin veil is like a function of land as opposed to culture? And are there portals to like this, to the other world?
I wonder if landscape makes a difference. Ballinasmittle, I actually have a house in West Cork, which is about 6 miles from Ballinasmittle. But in this little book, I talk about these experiences of the Irish landscape, particularly at twilight or dawn. It can be a very magical landscape, and it does actually induce a kind of skepticism against the kind of more scientific feel for nature. And it potentially can make you porous to a sense of things that doesn't fit into the modern scientific paradigm. In cities, I think in cities, what we see always is ourselves. We walk down the streets, the windows reflect us back to ourselves. The buildings reflect our power to construct. When we're closer to nature in a more elemental state, there's an otherness which doesn't reflect us back to ourselves. And I think we can become more open to something that is different. What it is, of course, there'll be people who say you're just projecting something, it's the imagination. I think myself that that's too simple. think it's if you begin to dwell in a certain landscape, your own soul undergoes transformations, and the feeling for the there-ness of things, the different sense grows. I mean, when I spend time in West Cork, I certainly feel different down there than when I get back into the city, and the bustle, the projects, the busyness, the loss of a kind of contemplative feel for something that isn't dependent on us in the long run. You know, we're guests in this totality, whereas in the city we think we're the masters. Look, we have constructed a city. And the Irish are, at least in Dublin, I mean, again, if I could speak, there in some ways are two Irelands. Dublin is hugely busy as a centre of economic activity, whereas out in the countryside things are they're slower. Economically, it's not as successful. Just a couple of weeks ago, I came from Ireland actually to Boston. I came down from Boston to here, but I had been down in West Cork. And when you drive up towards Dublin, as I was going up to Dublin, the traffic is almost non-existent until you come within about 40 miles, Newbridge of Dublin, and suddenly you could be on a highway in LA. And I wouldn't wish the highways of LA on anyone. Actually, I was in LA recently, but I used to try and get to the ocean as a therapy, as a kind of catharsis from the madness of the traffic. But then I'd go and look at the ocean and I'd be calm, like an eastern sage, and then I'd have to get back into my car and drive home. And by the time I got home, I was tearing my hair out. So that's not the way to live. Unfortunately, I still have hair to tear out, so that's one consolation. Please.
Just a brief thought or kind of a question. I noticed that with the first two, with College and with Berkeley, you related them specifically to their religious positions or their background.
Yeah.
And not so much with Jonathan Swift. I think maybe.
No.
So I was thinking about,
Right.
You were talking about the kind of spiritual versus the scientific and his mocking with science, and I also think of that as a kind of anti-colonial work.
Right.
Oliver's Travels is anti-colonial work, and I just wondered if you would relate his theological position as a VP of the Church of Ireland, right?
Right, exactly, yeah, the Church of Ireland. But I mean, this doubleness that I was talking about earlier, he wanted to become an insider in England, and he was very much involved in the higher echelons of the British nobility and aristocracy in England, hoping for preferment to a diocese that would pay a lot of money. But I forget the details exactly, but he wrote something once that the Queen was hugely irritated with him. So his prospects of advancement in the British establishment died. So he hated being sent back to Ireland. When he was sent back to Ireland to St. Patrick's Cathedral, so initially he hated it. So he had this sort of sense of division between Ireland and the mainland, but he settled down in Ireland and became a hero in Ireland because the Exchequer in England wanted to issue new coins in Ireland, and they gave the contract to a particular person who was going to use inferior coins. And he wrote these things called the Draper Letters, which were satirical attacks upon this proposal, and they were so effective that they had to withdraw the proposal. Everyone knew he had written this anonymously, so he became somewhat of a hero, not only among Protestants but among Catholics also in Dublin. So, but religiously, he was fundamentally conservative. He didn't like religious disagreement. So what his theology was in his heart of hearts, we don't really know. But he valued a kind of stability and worked within that. And his satires, of course, are, some people think he was in madness at various times. His madness at the madness itself of the human condition. But he was of the ascendancy, So this is again this porosity sometimes between these figures who are in the ascendancy but come to have a certain sympathy and even fight on behalf of the people who are on the lower rungs of the social and economic hierarchy. So it's that's a doubleness too, I think, which just a univocal history of Ireland doesn't really work. And we all have tendencies to be just univocal. Nobody here, of course, I understand that, but we're finally falling into a Beckettian silence.
I think it's probably time we conclude, and thank you very much.